The gunshot echoed through the night as Tabitha Winters clutched her 6-month-old daughter closer to her chest, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. The year was 1875, and the small mining town of Rockridge, Colorado had turned from a haven to a hell in the span of one cruel month. Blood trickled down her temple where Silas Blackwood, her late husband's business partner, had struck her with the butt of his pistol when she'd refused his demands. "Run," she whispered to herself, the baby surprisingly quiet against her breast, as if the tiny girl understood their very lives depended on silence. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and foreboding in the moonlight, but they offered what the town behind her no longer could escape. Tabitha had nothing but the clothes on her back, a small bundle of baby items hastily wrapped in a shawl, and the gold wedding band she'd slipped off her finger and into her pocket. 18 months of marriage to Edward Winters had ended with his body at the bottom of a mine shaft and his so-called partner claiming everything including, it seemed, Edward's widow. The night was bitter cold for early April, the mountain air cutting through her thin coat. Little Alice, bundled tightly against her, whimpered softly. "Hush now, sweetheart," Tabitha murmured, ducking behind a large boulder as she heard horses in the distance. "We'll find somewhere safe." But where? The nearest town was 30 miles away, and she couldn't possibly walk that far with a baby before Blackwood's men caught up. He wouldn't let her escape, not when she knew what he'd done to Edward. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that belied the danger Tabitha faced. She'd been walking for hours, her feet blistered in her impractical town boots, but terror kept her moving forward. Alice had begun to fuss, hungry and uncomfortable. "Just a little further, love," Tabitha promised, though she had no idea where they were headed. The mountain trail had grown steeper, rockier, and her strength was fading. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Had they found her already? She darted off the trail, crouching behind a fallen tree as a lone rider approached. Through the branches, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback, his broad shoulders topped by a wide-brimmed hat. Tabitha held her breath, pressing Alice's face gently against her shoulder to muffle any sounds. The baby, sensing her mother's fear, remained miraculously quiet. The rider slowed, then stopped. "I know you're there," a deep voice called out. "I don't mean you any harm." Tabitha remained silent, weighing her options. The man dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. "I saw you from the ridge," he continued. "Lady with a baby shouldn't be out here alone, especially not running from something." She swallowed hard. How had he known she was running? "Blackwood's men are about 2 miles back," he added, answering her unspoken question. "Heard them talking in town last night. Said a woman stole something valuable from him." "I stole nothing," Tabitha hissed before she could stop herself, then clapped a hand over her mouth. The man approached slowly, his hands visible at his sides. "Didn't figure you did. Blackwood's not the type to chase after a woman for stealing unless she took something that wasn't his to begin with." As he came closer, Tabitha could see him more clearly. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A faded blue bandana was knotted around his neck, and a gun belt hung low on his hips. He looked like every other cowboy she'd seen since coming west, except for the kindness in his eyes. "Name's Fletcher Reed," he said. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles up the mountain. You and the little one are welcome to shelter there until Blackwood and his boys move on." Alice chose that moment to let out a hungry wail. Tabitha rocked her desperately, but the baby's patience had reached its limit. "She needs feeding," Fletcher observed. "And you both need rest. My horse can carry you both. Why would you help us?" Tabitha asked, suspicious despite her desperate situation. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons for disliking Silas Blackwood, and I don't hold with men who'd hunt down a woman and baby." Tabitha hesitated, but the sound of distant voices made her decision for her. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." "Just Fletcher," he corrected, reaching out a hand to help her up. His palm was rough with calluses, but warm against her cold fingers. With surprising gentleness, he helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with his free hand. "You're safe with me," he said quietly near her ear as the horse began to climb the trail. "I promise you that." Tabitha didn't know why, but she believed him. Fletcher's cabin was nestled in a small clearing, sturdy and well-built with a corral for his horse and a small barn. Inside was simple but clean, a main room with a fireplace, kitchen area, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom. "It's not much," Fletcher said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's warm and Blackwood's men won't find it easily." "It's more than I could have hoped for," Tabitha replied honestly, Alice still fussing in her arms. Fletcher built up the fire while Tabitha tended to Alice, feeding her and changing her with the few supplies she'd managed to bring. When she returned to the main room, Fletcher had coffee brewing and was setting out bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "You should eat, then rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." Tabitha's legs nearly buckled from exhaustion as she sat at the table. "I don't know how to thank you." Fletcher shook his head. "No need for thanks. Any decent man would do the same." "You'd be surprised how few decent men there are in Rockridge," she replied bitterly. He poured her a cup of coffee. "How'd you end up there anyway? Most women don't choose mining towns." Tabitha sipped the hot, strong coffee gratefully. "My husband, Edward, brought me there after we married. He had a share in the Silver Crown mine with Silas Blackwood." She swallowed hard. "Edward died in a mining accident last month." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "Accident? That's what Blackwood called it," she said quietly. "Edward's body was found at the bottom of a shaft. Blackwood said he must have slipped." She looked down at her coffee. "But Edward knew those mines better than anyone. And the night before, he told me he'd discovered something about the mine's finances. Something that concerned him. And now Blackwood's after you," Fletcher concluded. Tabitha nodded. "He tried to force me to sell Edward's share of the mine to him. When I refused, he became insistent. Last night, he came to my home drunk, demanding I sign the papers." Her hand went unconsciously to the bruise forming on her temple. "I managed to get away with Alice, but he'll keep looking. He knows I overheard him talking about what really happened to Edward." Fletcher's jaw tightened again. "You'll be safe here for as long as you need." "I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," he cut in. "Been a mite lonely up here anyway." Tabitha studied him curiously. "What brings a man like you to live alone in the mountains?" A shadow crossed his face. "That's a story for another day, when you're not dead on your feet." He stood, gesturing to the bedroom. "You and the little one take the bed. I'll bunk out here by the fire." Too exhausted to argue, Tabitha thanked him again and carried Alice to the bedroom. The bed was neatly made with clean, if worn, blankets. She settled Alice in the center, building a barrier of pillows around her, then lay down beside her daughter, not bothering to remove more than her boots. Despite her fear and uncertainty, the rhythm of Alice's breathing and the knowledge that someone was keeping watch allowed Tabitha to slide into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since Edward's death. She woke to sunlight streaming through the small window and the smell of something cooking. Alice was awake beside her, gurgling happily and waving her tiny fists. "Good morning, sweet girl," Tabitha whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. After freshening up as best she could with the basin of water Fletcher had thoughtfully left, Tabitha carried Alice into the main room. Fletcher stood at the small stove, frying eggs and bacon. He turned at their entrance, and Tabitha was struck again by the kindness in his blue eyes. "Figured you might be hungry," he said. "Hope you like eggs." "They smell wonderful," she replied honestly. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she'd barely touched the food last night before exhaustion claimed her. As they ate, Tabitha studied her host more carefully in the daylight. Fletcher was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s. His brown hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and a few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. There was a scar that ran from his left ear down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, and his hands, while clean, bore the marks of hard work. "I rode out at first light to check if anyone was tracking you," he said, breaking into her thoughts. "Found some signs that Blackwood's men came partway up the mountain, but they turned back about 2 miles from here. Guess they figured you couldn't have made it this far on foot." Relief washed over her. "Thank God. They'll be back, though," Fletcher warned. "Blackwood's not the type to give up easily." "No," she agreed softly. "He's not." Alice began to fuss, and Tabitha lifted her from the makeshift cradle Fletcher had fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets. "She's a pretty little thing," Fletcher observed. "How old?" 6 months, Tabitha replied, bouncing Alice gently. She has Edward's eyes. A shadow crossed Fletcher's face again. I knew Edward. A bit, he said after a moment. Good man. Used to buy my pelts when I'd bring them to town. You're a trapper? Tabitha asked. Fletcher nodded. Among other things. Do some prospecting too, when the hunting's slow. Worked as a ranch hand before that, and rode with the cavalry during the war. A man of many talents, she said with a small smile. Jack of all trades, master of none, he replied, returning her smile. Been on my own since I was 16, had to learn to turn my hand to whatever would keep me fed. They spent the day settling into an unexpected but companionable routine. Fletcher showed Tabitha around the cabin and the immediate surroundings, pointing out the spring where he got his water and the berry bushes that would be bearing fruit in a few months. He fashioned a better cradle for Alice from a wooden chest, lining it with the softest furs he had. Tabitha insisted on cooking dinner, grateful to have something to do with her hands while she tried to make sense of her situation. The reality of her circumstances was beginning to sink, and she was homeless, nearly penniless, and being hunted by a dangerous man. If not for Fletcher's kindness, she and Alice might well have perished on the mountain. You're thinking too hard, Fletcher observed as they sat by the fire after dinner, Alice asleep in her new cradle. Tabitha sighed. I'm trying to figure out what to do next. I can't stay here forever, imposing on your hospitality. Like I said, it's no imposition, Fletcher replied. But I understand you'll want to make your own way eventually. There's a town about 20 miles west of here, Burlington. It's a decent place, growing fast with the railroad coming through. Might be opportunities there for a lady like yourself. A widow with a baby and no money? Tabitha said wryly. My opportunities seem limited to remarriage or taking in washing. Fletcher studied her. What did you do before you married? I was a teacher, she admitted. In St. Louis. I taught at a girls' school. His eyes lit up. Burlington's looking for a teacher, last I heard. Their schoolmarm got married and moved to Denver. Hope flickered in Tabitha's chest. Really? Do you think they would hire me? Can't see why not, Fletcher said. You're educated, and they're desperate. School's been closed for near 2 months now. For the first time since Edward's death, Tabitha felt a sense of possibility. I could teach again, she murmured. Alice and I could have a fresh start. That's the spirit, Fletcher encouraged. But there's no rush. Stay here until you're rested, and until we're sure Blackwood's given up the search. Tabitha looked at him curiously. You still haven't told me why you dislike Blackwood so much. Fletcher's expression hardened. Man like that collects enemies. But yours seems personal, she pressed gently. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. My younger brother, Caleb, worked in the Silver Crown mine, he said finally. 2 years ago, there was a cave-in. 7 men died, including Caleb. I'm so sorry, Tabitha said softly. The official story was that proper safety measures weren't followed, Fletcher continued, his voice tight. But I talked to some of the survivors. They said Blackwood had been warned about that section being unstable. He ordered them to keep digging anyway. Said they'd hit a rich vein and couldn't afford to stop. Tabitha's hand flew to her mouth. That's horrible. It's murder, Fletcher said flatly. But Blackwood owns the law in Rockridge. Nothing ever came of it. His eyes met hers. When I heard about your husband's accident, it didn't take much figuring to guess what really happened. Edward discovered Blackwood was embezzling from the mine, Tabitha said quietly. He was going to confront him with proof the next day. Fletcher nodded grimly. Sounds like Blackwood's pattern. Anyone who threatens his interests ends up dead. And now he wants me dead too, Tabitha whispered. That's not going to happen, Fletcher said firmly. Not while I'm breathing. The conviction in his voice made something warm unfurl in Tabitha's chest, even as fear continued to coil in her stomach. Days passed into weeks at the cabin, with Fletcher and Tabitha falling into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Fletcher hunted and tended his traps, while Tabitha kept the cabin, cooked their meals, and cared for Alice. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking about their lives before their paths had crossed. Fletcher told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about joining the Union Army at 18 and fighting in the brutal battles of the Civil War. He spoke of his brother Caleb with both fondness and pain, and of his wandering years after the war before settling in the Colorado mountains. Tabitha shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her years teaching, and how she'd met Edward when he came east seeking investors for the mine. Their courtship had been brief but passionate, and their journey west full of hope and dreams that had turned to ashes far too quickly. As April turned to May, the mountain bloomed with wildflowers and new growth. Fletcher began teaching Tabitha practical skills she'd never needed in town: how to identify edible plants, how to use a rifle, how to navigate by the stars. "You're a quick study," he remarked one afternoon as she successfully hit the target he'd set up for shooting practice. Tabitha lowered the rifle, pleased with herself. "I have a good teacher." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of awareness that had been building slowly since that first night. Tabitha looked away first, her cheeks warming. "Alice is probably awake from her nap," she said, handing him back the rifle. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Right. We should head back." As they walked back to the cabin, Tabitha was acutely conscious of his presence beside her. Tall and solid, he moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. She'd grown to trust him completely over these weeks, to rely on his strength and kindness. But lately, she'd begun to feel something more, a fluttering in her stomach when he smiled, a warmth when their hands accidentally touched. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. Edward had been gone only 2 months, and Fletcher had never indicated he saw her as anything more than someone in need of protection. The truth hit her suddenly: she didn't want to leave. The idea of going to Burlington, of starting over among strangers, no longer held the appeal it once had. Here, with Fletcher, she'd found not just safety but a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in a long time. But she couldn't stay indefinitely, living off his charity. And the longer she remained, the more complicated her feelings became. That evening, as they sat by the fire after Alice had been put to bed, Tabitha broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I think it's time Alice and I moved on to Burlington," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've imposed on your hospitality for nearly a month now." Fletcher looked up sharply from the piece of wood he'd been whittling. "You're not imposing." "Even so," she continued, "I need to start making a life for Alice and myself. You mentioned the teaching position. Blackwood's men are still looking for you." Fletcher interrupted. "I saw fresh tracks when I was checking my traps yesterday. They haven't given up." Tabitha's heart sank. "They can't search forever. Eventually, they'll have to assume we perished in the mountains." "You'd think so," Fletcher agreed. "But Blackwood's got a powerful motivation to find you. Word in town is that the mine's investors are asking questions about Edward's death. If you were to testify about what you know—" "I could ruin him," Tabitha finished. Fletcher nodded. "Which is why you're safer here for now." He hesitated, then added quietly, "And I've grown accustomed to having you and Alice around." Tabitha's pulse quickened. "Have you?" "Place was too quiet before," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Nice having someone to talk to besides my horse." She smiled despite herself. "We've enjoyed being here too. You've been kinder than I had any right to expect." Fletcher set aside his whittling. "Tabitha," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I want you to know that you and Alice are welcome here for as long as you want to stay. Not out of charity or obligation, but because—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "Because," she prompted softly. He met her gaze directly then, his blue eyes intense. "Because I care about you both. More than I expected to." Tabitha's breath caught. "Fletcher," a sudden noise outside the cabin made them both freeze. Fletcher was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he whispered, moving silently to the window. Tabitha's heart pounded as she watched him peer cautiously through the gap in the curtains. His posture relaxed slightly. "Just a deer," he said, turning back to her. "But we should be more careful. No lanterns after dark from now on, and we'll keep our voices down." The moment between them had broken, but the echo of his words, "I care about you both," lingered in Tabitha's mind as she bid him good night and retreated to the bedroom she shared with Alice. The next morning, Fletcher was unusually quiet as they ate breakfast. He seemed preoccupied, glancing frequently out the window. "Is something wrong?" Tabitha finally asked. Fletcher sighed. "I need to ride into town for supplies. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should check if there's any news about Blackwood." Fear gripped Tabitha. "Is that safe?" "I'll be careful," he assured her. "I don't go into Rockridge. There's a smaller settlement about 10 miles south where I do my trading. Blackwood's influence doesn't reach there." How long will you be gone? I should be back by nightfall, Fletcher said. But if I'm not, don't worry. Sometimes I stay over if the weather turns, or if I need to wait for supplies. Tabitha nodded, trying to hide her anxiety. It would be the first time she'd been alone since Fletcher had found her on the mountain. You remember how to use the rifle? He asked. Yes, she confirmed. Though I pray I won't need to. Fletcher squeezed her hand briefly. You'll be fine. Stay inside. Keep the door barred. And if anyone approaches who isn't me, take Alice and use the tunnel. The tunnel was actually a small root cellar that Fletcher had shown her early in her stay. It had a concealed exit that led to a dense thicket of trees about 50 yards from the cabin and escape route if the cabin was ever discovered. After Fletcher left, Tabitha tried to keep busy with her usual tasks, but the cabin felt emptier without his presence. Alice sensed her mother's unease and was fussier than usual, refusing to nap and crying at the slightest provocation. By late afternoon, Tabitha had managed to get Alice to sleep and was preparing a simple dinner when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats approaching the cabin. More than one horse. She doused the fire quickly, plunging the cabin into shadow, and peered cautiously out the window. 3 riders were approaching, and none of them was Fletcher. Moving silently but swiftly, Tabitha gathered Alice, still sleeping, and the small bundle of supplies Fletcher had prepared for just such an emergency. Her hands trembled as she lifted the trapdoor to the root cellar, descending carefully with Alice in one arm. Through the earthen walls, she could hear the men's voices as they reached the cabin. Looks like someone lives here. Check inside. Could be the woman's holed up with some mountain man. The sound of the cabin door being forced open made Tabitha flinch. She moved quickly through the root cellar, finding the narrow tunnel that led outside. Alice was beginning to stir, making small sounds of distress. Shoo, baby, Tabitha whispered desperately. Please, be quiet for Mama. By some miracle, Alice settled again as Tabitha reached the concealed exit. She paused, listening. The men were still inside the cabin, their voices muffled but clearly angry at finding it empty. She's been here, one said. There's baby things. Search the area, another commanded. They can't have gone far. Tabitha pushed open the hidden door and slipped out into the fading daylight, keeping low among the bushes. Fletcher had shown her a place to hide if this ever happened, a small cave about a quarter-mile up the mountain, well concealed by rocks and vegetation. Moving as quietly as possible, Tabitha made her way up the steep slope, constantly glancing back to see if she was being followed. Alice, perhaps sensing the danger, remained remarkably quiet, only making occasional soft noises that Tabitha quickly soothed. The sun was setting by the time she reached the cave, casting long shadows through the trees. Tabitha crawled inside, settling Alice in the driest corner before covering the entrance with the branches Fletcher had prepared for this purpose. Now we wait, she whispered to her daughter, praying Fletcher would return soon and somehow know where to find them. Hours passed. Darkness fell completely, and the mountain grew cold. Tabitha wrapped Alice in the blanket she'd brought, holding her close for warmth. Every sound outside made her tense: the rustle of leaves, the call of a night bird, the distant howl of a wolf. She must have dozed, for she woke with a start to the sound of someone approaching the cave. Alice was still asleep in her arms, her tiny face peaceful in the darkness. Tabitha held her breath as footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. A branch moved from the entrance, and she pressed herself further back into the shadows. Tabitha. Fletcher's voice, low and urgent. Are you in there? It's me. Relief flooded through her. Fletcher. Yes, we're here. He crawled into the cave, his face barely visible in the darkness. Thank God. I saw the cabin had been searched. I was afraid. His voice broke off. We got out in time, Tabitha assured him. I heard them coming and used the tunnel, just like you showed me. Fletcher's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing tightly. You did well. But we can't go back to the cabin. Blackwood's men will return. What do we do now? Tabitha asked, fear creeping back into her voice. I've got my horse hidden nearby, Fletcher said. We need to leave tonight. Head for Burlington. It's our best chance. Tonight? In the dark? It's safer, he explained. They won't expect us to travel at night, especially with the baby. And I know these mountains well enough to navigate by starlight. Tabitha nodded, though he probably couldn't see it in the darkness. Whatever you think is best." They waited another hour to ensure Blackwood's men had truly gone before venturing out of the cave. Fletcher led Tabitha to where his horse was tethered, a sturdy bay gelding that nickered softly at their approach. "I'll take Alice," Fletcher said, carefully accepting the bundle from Tabitha's arms. "You mount first, then I'll hand her up to you." The journey through the mountains in darkness was terrifying and exhilarating at once. Fletcher led the horse on foot at first, picking their way carefully down the steepest parts of the trail. Once they reached more level ground, he mounted behind Tabitha, one arm around her waist to steady her and Alice as they rode. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and feed Alice. Dawn found them on the western side of the mountains, looking down into a broad valley where Burlington lay in the distance. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Fletcher decided, helping Tabitha dismount in a sheltered grove of trees. "It's not safe to ride into town looking like fugitives." He built a small, smokeless fire and produced some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. Tabitha fed Alice, then ate her own meager breakfast, her body aching from the long night's ride. "What happens when we reach Burlington?" she asked as they sat side by side, watching the sun rise fully over the valley. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "You should be safe there. Blackwood's influence doesn't extend that far west. You can inquire about the teaching position, start fresh." "And you?" Tabitha asked softly. He glanced at her, then away. "I'll make sure you're settled, then move on." "Move on." The words felt like a physical blow. "But I thought, last night, you said you cared about us." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "I do. That's why I need to leave. As long as I'm with you, you're in danger. Blackwood wants me dead almost as much as he wants you silenced." "Because of your brother?" "Because I've been gathering evidence against him for 2 years, Fletcher admitted. Testimonies from miners, records of safety violations, proof of his embezzlement. I was nearly ready to take it to the federal marshal when you showed up on that mountain trail." Tabitha stared at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Didn't want to worry you more than you already were," he said with a shrug. "And then, well, it started to matter less than keeping you and Alice safe." "So your plan is to leave us in Burlington and go after Blackwood alone?" Tabitha couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "It's the only way to ensure he can't hurt anyone else," Fletcher said firmly. "Including you. And if something happens to you," she challenged. "What then?" "I've arranged for my evidence to go to the marshal if I don't return," he replied. "One way or another, Blackwood will face justice." Tabitha shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "There has to be another way." Fletcher turned to her then, his expression softening. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Tabitha, these past weeks with you and Alice, they've been the happiest I've had in years. In another life, maybe." "Why not this life?" she whispered, leaning into his touch. "We could leave, go further west, or north to Wyoming or Montana, somewhere Blackwood would never find us, and live in fear forever." Fletcher shook his head. "That's no life for you or Alice. Neither is losing you," Tabitha said, surprising herself with the admission. Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. "Tabitha," the sound of approaching horses cut him off. They both froze, listening. "Get behind those rocks," Fletcher whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Take Alice and stay hidden, no matter what happens." Tabitha wanted to argue, but Alice's safety had to come first. She scrambled behind the large boulders Fletcher had indicated, cradling Alice close and praying the baby wouldn't cry. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see Fletcher positioning himself behind a tree, rifle ready. The riders came into view, 3 men, the same ones who had searched the cabin. Well, the leader called out, spotting Fletcher. "If it ain't Fletcher Reed. Heard you might be harboring a fugitive." "Don't know what you're talking about, Jenkins," Fletcher replied calmly. "I live alone." Jenkins, a burly man with a scar across his nose, laughed. "That ain't what we found at your cabin. Baby cradle, woman's things." "Where is she, Reed?" "Where's the Winters woman?" "Probably halfway to California by now," Fletcher said. "Smart woman would be." "Blackwood wants her found," another man said, "offering $500 to whoever brings her in." "Dead or alive?" Fletcher asked, his voice hard. Jenkins smiled nastily. "Didn't specify, but he was real clear about what should happen to anyone helping her." He drew his pistol. "Nothing personal, Reed. Just business." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Tabitha, could barely comprehend it. Jenkins fired, the shot going wide as Fletcher dove for cover. The other two men drew their weapons as Fletcher returned fire, hitting one in the shoulder. The wounded man fell from his horse, cursing loudly. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the sound deafening in the quiet morning. Tabitha pressed her hand over Alice's ear, the other ear protected against her chest, as the baby began to wail in terror. She saw Fletcher take aim again, dropping the second man with a shot to the leg. But Jenkins had circled around, getting a clear shot at Fletcher's exposed side. Without thinking, Tabitha grabbed a rock and hurled it at Jenkins with all her strength. It struck his arm just as he fired, sending his shot wide. Fletcher spun at the sound, firing in one fluid motion. Jenkins clutched his chest, a look of surprise on his face as he toppled from his saddle. The clearing fell silent except for the moans of the wounded men and Alice's continued crying. Fletcher ran to where Tabitha was hidden. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes wild with concern. "We're fine," she assured him, though her entire body was shaking. "What about you?" "Not a scratch," he said, helping her to her feet. "But we need to move. Those shots might bring others." They gathered their few belongings quickly. Fletcher checked the fallen men. Jenkins was dead, but the other two were only wounded. "What about them?" Tabitha asked. "They'll live," Fletcher said grimly. "But they won't follow us anytime soon." He helped Tabitha onto his horse, then mounted behind her. As they rode away, Tabitha could feel his heart hammering against her back, his arm tight around her waist. "Thank you," he said quietly after they'd ridden in silence for some time. "That rock probably saved my life." "I couldn't let him shoot you," Tabitha replied simply. Fletcher's arm tightened around her. "This changes things," he said. "Blackwood will know for certain we're together now. Burlington might not be safe after all. Then where do we go?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "I have a friend in Wyoming, Frank Tillman. He owns a ranch near Cheyenne. We'd be safe there while we figure out our next move." "Wyoming," Tabitha repeated. It seemed impossibly far, yet the prospect of continuing this journey with Fletcher filled her with a strange hope. "It's a long ride," Fletcher warned. 4, maybe 5 days if we're careful. Are you up for it?" Tabitha thought of the alternative, being separated from the man who had risked everything to protect her and Alice. The man she was growing to love. "Yes," she said firmly. "We'll go to Wyoming." They reached Burlington by midday, staying just long enough to purchase supplies and for Tabitha to buy a few necessities for herself and Alice with the money from her wedding ring. Fletcher bought a second horse, a gentle mare that Tabitha could ride while he carried Alice. They left town quickly, heading north toward the Wyoming territory. The terrain grew wilder, the settlements fewer and farther between as they traveled. Each night, they made camp in sheltered locations, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. On their third night on the trail, as they sat by a small fire after Alice had fallen asleep, Fletcher finally spoke of what had been growing between them. "I never expected to find someone like you," he said quietly, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "After Caleb died, I figured I'd live out my days alone in those mountains." Tabitha looked at him across the fire. "And now I'm wondering if maybe there's a different path," he admitted. "If we make it to Wyoming, if we can find a way to deal with Blackwood, maybe there could be something more for us." Hope bloomed in Tabitha's chest. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Alice needs a father. A real one, not the monster who took hers away." Fletcher's gaze was intense. "And what do you need, Tabitha?" "Someone to trust," she whispered. "Someone to build a life with. Someone who makes me feel safe, not because he protects me, but because when I'm with him, I'm not afraid of what tomorrow might bring." Fletcher moved around the fire to sit beside her. Hesitantly, as if giving her time to pull away, he reached for her hand. When their fingers intertwined, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said. "Don't have much to offer except my hands and my heart." "That's all I want," Tabitha replied. "That's all Alice and I need." Slowly, Fletcher leaned forward. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that deepened as Tabitha responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly. "We should rest," Fletcher said, though he made no move to release her hand. "Long ride tomorrow." Tabitha nodded, reluctantly pulling away. But as she settled beside Alice for the night, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The remaining journey to Wyoming passed without incident. The mountains gave way to rolling hills and wide, open grasslands that seemed to stretch forever beneath an endless blue sky. Alice, who had been remarkably resilient throughout their ordeal, began to smile and laugh more, especially when Fletcher would sing to her in his surprisingly melodious baritone. They crossed into Wyoming territory on the 4th day, and by mid-afternoon of the 5th, they crested a rise to see a sprawling ranch in the valley below. Tillman's place, Fletcher said, pointing to the collection of buildings surrounded by fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Best cattle operation in the territory. Will your friend really take us in? Tabitha asked anxiously. Fletcher nodded confidently. Frank and I served together during the war. He'd give me the shirt off his back, and I'd do the same for him. He's a good man, you'll like him. As they rode into the ranch yard, a tall man with a shock of gray hair emerged from the main house. He squinted at them for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. Fletcher Reed, as I live and breathe, he called, striding toward them. Been too many years, friend. Fletcher dismounted, clasping the older man's hand warmly. Good to see you, Frank. Frank Tillman's keen eyes took in Tabitha and Alice. And who might these lovely ladies be? This is Tabitha Winters and her daughter, Alice. Fletcher introduced them. There, with me. Something in Fletcher's tone made Frank's eyebrows rise, but he simply nodded and tipped his hat to Tabitha. Madam, any friend of Fletcher's is welcome at my ranch. Thank you, Mr. Tillman, Tabitha said, relieved at the warmth in his weathered face. Just Frank, please, he insisted, helping her down from her horse. Let's get you all inside. You look like you've had a long journey. The Tillman ranch house was spacious and comfortable, with a homey feel that Tabitha appreciated after weeks of travel. Frank's wife, Martha, a plump, cheerful woman with kind eyes, fussed over Alice and insisted that Tabitha take a hot bath while she watched the baby. That evening, after a hearty meal, and once Alice was asleep in the small bedroom Martha had prepared for them, Fletcher and Frank sat on the porch with glasses of whiskey while Tabitha and Martha remained in the kitchen, cleaning up. Your Fletcher seems like a good man, Martha said, her eyes twinkling as she handed Tabitha a plate to dry. He's not my Fletcher, Tabitha protested, though her blush betrayed her. Martha chuckled. The way he looks at you says different, dear, and I've never seen him so taken with a child as he is with your little Alice. Tabitha smiled softly. He's been our protector. I don't know what would have happened to us without him. From what Frank tells me, Fletcher's been alone too long, Martha said. Lost his brother a few years back, never really got over it. It's good to see him with light in his eyes again. Through the window, Tabitha could see Fletcher and Frank deep in conversation, Fletcher's expression serious as he gestured with his hands. She knew he was telling Frank about Blackwood, about the danger that had followed them from Colorado. Will you stay? Martha asked, following her gaze. I don't know, Tabitha admitted. It depends on what happens with the situation we left behind. Martha patted her hand. Well, you're welcome here for as long as you need. Frank's been saying we should hire a teacher for the children on the ranch and the neighboring homesteads. They have to ride 10 miles to the nearest school now. Tabitha's eyes widened. A teaching position? Here, if you're interested, Martha confirmed. We've got an old bunkhouse that could be converted into a schoolroom with a little work. Hope surged through Tabitha once again. I'd be very interested. Teaching is all I ever wanted to do before I married. Martha smiled warmly. Then it settled. You and Alice will stay, at least until the school is ready. And perhaps by then, other things will have sorted themselves out as well. She glanced meaningfully toward Fletcher. Later that night, as Tabitha sat on the edge of the bed in their borrowed room, Fletcher knocked softly on the door. Come in, she called quietly, mindful of Alice sleeping in the small crib Martha had provided. Fletcher entered, closing the door behind him. He'd clearly just washed up, his hair was damp, his face freshly shaved. Frank's offered me a job, he said without preamble. Foreman position. His current man is moving to Oregon next month. Tabitha's heart leapt. Are you going to take it? Thinking about it, Fletcher said, sitting beside her on the bed. Martha mentioned she offered you the teaching position. She did, Tabitha confirmed. It sounds perfect. Fletcher took her hand. We could build a life here, Tabitha. You, me, and Alice. Away from Blackwood and the past. What about your evidence against Blackwood? she asked. Your need for justice for Caleb and Edward. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Frank's sending a trusted man to Colorado tomorrow. He'll deliver my evidence to the federal marshal in Denver. It's time to let the law handle Blackwood. His eyes met hers. I've found something more important to fight for now. Tabitha's breath caught. Fletcher, I love you, Tabitha, he said simply. I think I have since that first night on the mountain. You and Alice. You've become my world. I want to be a husband to you and a father to her, if you'll have me. Tears filled Tabitha's eyes. We've known each other such a short time, she whispered, though her heart was already answering yes. Sometimes a person just knows, Fletcher replied, lifting her hand to his lips. I've wandered most of my life, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But with you, I'm home. Tabitha leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. I love you too, she admitted. And Alice adores you. Nothing would make me happier than for us to be a family. Their lips met in a tender kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows. When they parted, Fletcher's smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. Mrs. Tillman mentioned there's a preacher coming through next Sunday, he said. If you're willing, we could be married then. Start our new life proper. Yes, Tabitha said without hesitation. Next Sunday. 2 weeks later, Tabitha stood in the Tillman's parlor wearing a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her alter. Alice, dressed in a new white gown sewn by Martha's nimble fingers, gurgled happily in Frank's arms as he prepared to give Tabitha away. The ranch hands and neighboring families had gathered to witness the ceremony, filling the house with warmth and goodwill. Fletcher waited by the fireplace with the traveling preacher, looking handsome and nervous in a new shirt and vest. As Tabitha walked toward him on Frank's arm, she marveled at how much her life had changed in just 2 months. From the terror of that night in Rockridge to this moment of perfect joy, it seemed almost too much to believe. Fletcher took her hands in his as they stood before the preacher. His eyes never left hers as they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish one another for all their days. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared. Mr. Fletcher Reed, you may kiss your bride. Fletcher's lips found hers amid the cheers and applause of their new friends and neighbors. When he finally pulled away, he whispered, You're safe with me. Always. Tabitha smiled up at him, her heart full. I know, she whispered back. And you're safe with us. Frank stepped forward, placing Alice in Fletcher's arms. The baby reached up, patting Fletcher's face with her tiny hands as if giving her blessing to the union. The gathered crowd laughed and cheered again as Fletcher pressed a gentle kiss to Alice's forehead. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than Tabitha had seen in one place since leaving St. Louis. As the sun began to set, she found herself on the porch, watching the golden light spill across the vast Wyoming landscape. Fletcher joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. Happy Mrs. Reed? He asked, his voice warm in her ear. Completely, she replied, leaning into him. I never imagined finding such happiness after Edward died. I thought Alice and I would be alone. Not alone, Fletcher assured her. Not ever again. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry a reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them, beautiful and dangerous and free. I got a telegram from Denver this morning, Fletcher said after a while. Didn't want to tell you until after the wedding. Didn't want anything to spoil today. Tabitha tensed slightly. What did it say? The marshal arrested Blackwood 3 days ago, Fletcher told her, his voice steady. The evidence was enough. He's facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, and the murders of Edward and Caleb, along with the other miners who died in that cave-in. Relief washed over Tabitha like a cool rain. It's over, then, she whispered. Truly over. It is, Fletcher confirmed. We can build our life here without looking over our shoulders. Tabitha turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. Thank you for saving us that day, for saying those words that gave me hope when I had none left. Fletcher smiled, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. You're the one who saved me, Tabitha. I was just existing before you came into my life. Now I'm living again. From inside came the sound of Alice crying, ready for her evening feeding. Tabitha and Fletcher shared a smile before going in together to tend to their daughter. 1 year later, the schoolhouse gleamed white in the summer sun, its fresh paint a stark contrast to the green of the surrounding pastures. Tabitha stood on the small porch, watching as the last of her students galloped away on their ponies, heading home for the summer break. At 25 students, the Tillman Ranch School had exceeded everyone's expectations. Children came from as far as 15 miles away to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and history from Mrs. Reed, whose reputation as a firm but kind teacher had spread throughout the county. Tabitha gathered her books and papers, locking the schoolhouse door behind her. The walk to the small house she shared with Fletcher and Alice was a pleasant one, particularly on this beautiful June day. Wildflowers bloomed along the path, and meadowlarks sang in the tall grass. The past year had been one of growth and healing. News had reached them that Silas Blackwood had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. The Silver Crown mine had been sold to new owners who operated it safely and fairly. Fletcher had received a portion of the proceeds as compensation for his brother's death, which he'd used to buy a small parcel of land adjoining the Tillman Ranch. There, he and some of the ranch hands had built the cozy 3-room house that was now their home. As Tabitha approached, she saw Fletcher in the garden they'd planted, Alice toddling beside him on sturdy little legs. At 18 months, Alice was a bundle of energy and curiosity, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. "Mama," Alice called, spotting Tabitha. She wobbled toward her mother as fast as her legs would carry her. Tabitha scooped her up, covering her chubby face with kisses. "Hello, my sweet girl. Have you been helping Papa with the garden?" "She's been helping me eat all the strawberries," Fletcher said with a grin, coming to greet his wife with a kiss. "Didn't leave many for jam making, I'm afraid." "That's all right," Tabitha laughed, noting the red stains around Alice's mouth. "There will be more tomorrow." Fletcher took her books, and they walked hand in hand to the house. Inside, the simple rooms were filled with touches that made it a home: curtains Tabitha had sewn, a bookshelf Fletcher had built, toys for Alice carved by his skilled hands. "School's out for summer, then?" Fletcher asked as they settled on the porch after supper, watching the sunset. Alice played with wooden blocks at their feet. "Yes," Tabitha confirmed. "Just in time, I think." Fletcher looked at her curiously. "In time for what?" Tabitha took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "In time for me to rest before this little one arrives in January." Fletcher's eyes widened, then filled with joy. "A baby? We're having another baby." Tabitha nodded, laughing as he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "Alice is going to be a big sister," he exclaimed, setting Tabitha down to swing Alice up into his arms. "Did you hear that, little one? You're going to have a brother or sister." Alice giggled, not understanding but caught up in her father's happiness. "Baby?" she asked, patting Tabitha's stomach. "That's right, sweetheart," Tabitha confirmed. "A new baby." That night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Fletcher held Tabitha close, his hand protectively over the new life growing within her. "I never thought I could be this happy," he murmured against her hair. "Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a dream." "Not a dream," Tabitha assured him, turning to face him. "Just a different life than either of us expected." Fletcher kissed her softly. "When I found you on that mountain trail, you were running for your life. Now look at us: a home, a family, a future. All because you said those words I needed so desperately to hear." Tabitha reminded him. "You're safe with me." "And you are," Fletcher promised. "You and Alice and this new little one. Safe and loved, always." As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Tabitha reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate flight from danger to this peaceful life in Wyoming, it seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had been built one day at a time, with courage and hope and love. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods, a gentle lullaby for the family safe within. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, but they would face them together, just as they had everything else since that fateful night on a Colorado mountain when a frightened woman with a baby in her arms had found safety in the arms of a cowboy with a heart as vast as the western sky. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the rocking our ranch as Fletcher rode in from checking the north pasture. The herd was doing well: 30 head of cattle and 10 horses, not counting the new foals. It wasn't the largest spread in Wyoming, but it was theirs, bought with savings and hard work after 3 years on the Tillman Ranch. As he approached the house, Fletcher smiled at the sight that greeted him. 6-year-old Alice sat on the porch steps, reading aloud to her 4-year-old brother, Edward, named for the father he would never know but whose memory they honored. Next to them, 2-year-old Charlotte played with a wooden horse Fletcher had carved for her last Christmas. Tabitha emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, a few strands escaping to frame her face. To Fletcher, she was more beautiful than ever. "Papa's home," Alice called, setting aside her book to run to him as he dismounted. Fletcher caught her, swinging her high before setting her down to greet Edward and Charlotte. "Have you been good for your mama today?" Edward put a frog in Charlotte's cradle, Alice reported solemnly. "But I took it outside before she saw it." Fletcher tried to look stern as he glanced at his son. "Is that true, young man?" Edward scuffed his boot in the dirt. "It was a friendly frog," he muttered. Tabitha laughed, coming to greet Fletcher with a kiss. "Your son is developing quite the mischievous streak," she said. "Much like his father, I suspect." Fletcher feigned innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mrs. Reed." Their life had settled into a rhythm that suited them perfectly. Tabitha still taught school 3 days a week in the building that had once been a bunkhouse, but was now a proper schoolhouse with 25 students. Fletcher ran their small ranch with the help of 2 hired hands, raising cattle and breaking horses for the larger spreads in the area. Frank and Martha Tillman remained their closest friends and were honorary grandparents to their children. The 2 families shared Sunday dinners and celebrated holidays together, creating new traditions that blended their diverse backgrounds. As they sat on the porch that evening after the children were in bed, Fletcher took Tabitha's hand. "I got a letter from Denver today," he said. "Blackwood died in prison last month." Tabitha was silent for a moment, absorbing the news. "How do you feel about that?" she asked finally. Fletcher considered the question. "At peace, I think. The man paid for his crimes. Caleb and Edward got their justice." He squeezed her hand. "And we got our happy ending, despite his best efforts." "Not an ending," Tabitha corrected gently. "A beginning that's still unfolding." Fletcher smiled, pulling her closer. "You're right, as usual." He kissed her temple. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "You might have mentioned it," Tabitha teased, "but I never tire of hearing it." "I love you, Tabitha Reed," Fletcher said, his voice low and sincere. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "My cowboy who kept his promise." As night fell over the Wyoming plains, they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the cricket song and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. From Alice's miraculous survival during their desperate flight from Rockridge to the thriving family they'd built together, every step of their journey had led them here to this land, this home, this life filled with love. Fletcher thought of that fateful day when he'd found Tabitha on the mountain trail, terrified and alone with her baby. The words he'd spoken then had been a promise he'd dedicated his life to keeping. "You're safe with me." And they were all of them safe and loved and free to build their future together under the vast Wyoming sky.